In 1898, when my father was 20 years old, they mustered his regiment of the West Riding Volunteers. The old Queen Victoria was at war with the Boers in South Africa. Now, my father didn't have the faintest idea who the Boers were. He only knew that he was called upon, and that was what life was like in those days. They came off the moors and out of the mill towns, and they gathered together and they marched them as a regiment, route marched them to Liverpool. But they got to Liverpool at 4 o'clock in the morning, and there were no lights there except on the quay, so my father never saw Liverpool. They went aboard the boat. And the extraordinary fact is that this rural Yorkshireman, the first city he ever saw in his life was Cape Town. They marched into action wearing the new khaki, the new uniform which was supposed to make them invisible, but they also wore white pipe-clad belts and white pipe-clad helmets. And like that, they advanced against Boer farmers who, with a rifle, could hit a sandy-coloured lion at about half a mile. So naturally enough, things didn't go very well at the beginning. But after they fired a few British generals, they began to get the thing together, my coat hanger again, they began to get the thing together, and they finally had their first victory against the Boers at a place called Paardeberg. And my father was wounded there. And lying on a stretcher, he saw this. Incidentally, Paardeberg means horse town, which is appropriate enough in the circumstances. And this was the cart, the battle cart, in which the Boer General Cronje came in to surrender. And it astounded my father, because he never before had seen a two-wheel cart driven by a pair of horses. It looked impossible to him. And when he showed me that picture, later on, when I was young, it astounded me just as much, because in our experience of driving, which in those days was every day, we had just two ways of doing things. Either for light work, we had a single horse in a two-wheel cart, or for heavier loads, we had two horses in a four-wheel cart. Now, if you look at a single horse pulling a two-wheel cart, you'll be able to see how the apparatus is controlled. Here's my little pony, Kuchi. She's driving a little two-wheel float, and if you look at the shaft, you'll see there in the tugs on the round, fastened round her middle, and she's controlling the cart. It cannot tip forwards or tip back, which a two-wheel cart would otherwise do. So that's how she held it. And when she comes to a hill, we're just coming to a hill now, she sits back in that strap round her bottom, which is called the britchin. She sits in her britchin, and she uses her behind to put on the brakes. And thus she controls the weight of the cart when it would tend to overrun down the hill. So that's a two-wheeler, but for heavier loads we had a four-wheel cart, because the horses couldn't possibly prevent a heavy load from tipping, so it had to stand on four wheels. And equally, with a pole instead of shafts, it was difficult to put a britchin on it. So when they came to the hill, the driver used his brake, and he took the weight of the cart off the horses, slackened their traces, and controlled the cart himself on the way down the hill. It was such a contrast to everything we knew that I became fascinated by the Cape cart. In fact, quite honestly, I've been fascinated by it by more than half a century. I knew of two occasions in which two horses had driven in the two-wheel cart. The first was the curricle. The curricle was the speed job of the rich Regency bucks. It was the Ferrari of its day, so to speak. And they put two blood horses in it just in order to make it a speed job, but unfortunately it wasn't safe like modern sports cars are, because the only way they could couple them to carry the pole was to put a steel bar across their backs down there and another pole down to the pole. That meant that the two horses were absolutely locked together, and if one horse tripped and went down, he dragged the other one with him. They spent their whole time crashing these things until in the end even they gave them up. The other one was in India. A vehicle called the Tonga, which is supposed to have been descended from Alexander's chariots, with a yoke over the shoulders. And these were used simply because the Indians had such miserable little ponies that they couldn't even pull a two-wheel cart by themselves. That was even more unsafe. And almost all the pictures you've ever seen of a Tonga are like this one. In other words, a crash.
Well, bearing all that in mind, how did the Boer farmers do it? And more particularly, why did they do it? Well, my interest in the matter continued, and along the way I found in this book, which is over 100 years old, a picture of the first Cape cart that ever came to England. It was sent as a present from Cape Colony to King Edward VII when he was Prince of Wales in 1877. And it caused a great deal of interest. And this has two features which immediately strike us. First of all, it's covered, unlike most two-wheel carts. This is because they get such tremendous thunderstorms on the high veldt in Africa. My father told me, perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, that he once saw a mule knocked flat by a hailstone as big as a goose egg. And at the end of the pole here, there is a bar that goes across, loosely attached with straps on it. This the Boers called the bugle, and it proved to be the key to the whole thing. In the same book, also, there was at last a picture of the Cape cart harness. And you can see here that that bugle, here, is hung from the horse's necks, from what we call the trace carriers, and they carry the weight of the cart with that. So now we were on the track, and armed with all this information and realizing that if I didn't do it now, I probably would never do it after 50 years of waiting, this year we set out to do it for ourselves. Of course, we didn't have a Cape cart. But what we did was to take the shafts off one of the exercise carts and put a pole on instead. And for the sake of other interested drivers, I should say that we learned this pole should be about a foot longer than you would have for normal pair driving. And then we made the yoke, what the Boers call the bugle, we've come to call the yoke. We made this from an 1.25 inch ash handle from hay rakes, the best sort of straight grain wood you can get. And there are the two straps from which it hangs from the horse's neck. And this business of it hanging from the horse's neck had worried me from the beginning, because it's all very well in the case of a shaft cart or the curricle for it to take the weight on a horse's back, or the tonga, where it's taken on a yoke up on the horse's shoulders. But it seemed to me, from hanging from almost the crest of the neck, the weight of the cart might be unreasonable strain on a horse, and yet it's clear that this yoke is in fact the key to the whole operation. So we started off by deciding to get some sort of measurement in order to ease our minds as to how much weight these horses would be carrying on their necks. So with a bit of binder twine, and then we'll go and get the old spring balance that we used to use for weighing potatoes. We'll try and find out what that weight is. If you can still read this thing, it's high time I gave it a bit of a polish up. So there's the weight of the pole lying on the two horses' necks, and it comes to, I think, about 15 pounds, yes, 15 pounds. So that's 7 pounds per horse. Well, perhaps it doesn't sound too bad, but when we put Jeff up in the seat to balance the cart, it dropped to 4, which is 2 pounds per horse. And when we put Sue up in the passenger seat, and it balanced itself finally, it dropped to 2, which is 1 pound per horse, which of course is hardly more than the weight of a perfectly ordinary driving collar. So that's how the pole hangs from the neck. But what happens if the cart tips back instead of trying to tip forward? Well, we had learned that you have to have a pole strap which goes over the pole and under the horses' bellies. And thus. The other thing is that this is completely floating. That puzzled me very much. It seemed to me that the yoke would move slash sideways, and that the whole thing would move up and down and get the horses out of kilter with the cart, particularly if you were moving fast over rough ground, which of course they used to do. However, we had in the meanwhile met a saddler who knew something about Cape cart harness, and we received the assurance that that should be a floating link for the yoke. In the meanwhile, we'd had ourselves a set of double Cape harness made. The difference to an ordinary double harness, of course, is that it's got breechings. The Boers did use these, and it's also got the special neck pieces with the rings into which you're going to hang the yoke straps. So we're getting pretty close to it. The only thing is our pair of horses started off as nothing like a pair. They were two nice fell ponies, a gelding belonging to me and a mare belonging to Jeff, but they had very, very different ways of life. My gelding had just won a trotting race at 16 miles an hour, and Jeff's mare was distinctly quiet, not to say almost sluggish. So how they were going to get on together as a pair, we didn't know, but we knew it would mean some work, because when you talk about a matched pair, you really mean matched in pace. Nowadays, in the show days, they make an awful lot of fuss about match in colour. Nobody bothered much about a pair being matched in colour when I was young. What mattered was the pace match. There we are, you see pole straps in front, then the yoke, and then behind it the thing. Well, we set off to do it. And of course we put the two horses in to live together side by side for a bit until they got used to one another and they became friends. And then we started to work them together with leaders. So we were not only making a pair, we were also learning the truth about Cape Cart after all this 50 years of waiting. And they very soon settled to go together. They would do in Jeff's hands. And in a week, we were without leaders. By now they were going nice and easy together. And we were beginning to feel there was something to this Cape harness, because it seemed to work very sweet indeed. The only trouble we had with the horses actually was that they tended to walk very far apart. They seemed to get as far away from the pole as they could. We wondered if this had got something to do with the harness, but by the time we got to this point, we discovered the truth. We swapped the two horses round left and right, and they went absolutely perfectly when they were the other way around. So it had nothing to do with the harness at all. And by now they've got almost a little park trot. What a difference he's made to those two horses in just a week or two. And we've all got used to it. It's absolutely fascinating. There's always been a mystery and you knew absolutely nothing about it all this time to suddenly find out. And look at that ground. That was in the middle of the drought. You wouldn't believe it, would you? And that exercise paddock by November was bright green. But look what it was like in high summer. You see? Yoke and pole strap. And then the day came when we were out of the exercise ground and round the lanes. Lovely way to drive it proved to be. We proved quite a sensation in some of the villages. The only thing is, we still hadn't got a Cape cart. I see the Boer farmer's Cape cart over there on the right, parked on the main street of Johannesburg, just a year or two before he drove it into battle against the British. And down on the left there's one of the big Boer wagons. They were the reason why these streets were so wide. In every one of their towns they built a street wide enough for a man to turn a team in, because they transported everything across the whole country. You see it there, it's got a team of how many? It looks like 12 oxen. And they are an essential part in the story of the Cape cart. Now, 82 years later, after a long search, I had in fact discovered a cart, a continental-built cart, in a state of fair ruin, but with its essential sound, which had all the characteristics of what a Cape cart needed to have. It had the frame of a hood on it, which was still reparable. It had very tall wheels, which it should do, and the wheels were set low down between the axle, which was another characteristic. And so we set out to restore this. We retired it. We had a new hood made. We painted it lovingly. And then we finally transferred the pole and the yoke and our now pretty well-trained pair of horses to it, and we set off to make a journey across the high veldt of Africa. In order to do this, we found a place on Salisbury Plain. And my wife, who knows Africa, told me, as a matter of fact, it didn't look half bad impersonation of that landscape in certain parts, at any rate. At last, in England, the Boer General's fighting cart travels. And how beautifully it did travel. The horses were going well, and the ride was about the best ride I've ever had in a cart over rough ground. Jeff, who's driven many more carts than I have, said the same thing. My worry about the fact that I thought the yoke would move around side to side and up and down the pole was unjustified. It did move up and down and round about and around the pole, and that, in fact, seemed to be the crux of the whole thing. That's why the whole thing went so beautifully. My father said to his fellow farmers when he came back to Yorkshire that the finest cross-country cart in the world was undoubtedly the Cape cart that they'd met in the Boer War. And I am now convinced that he was right. The horses loved it. They trotted and moved with the greatest of ease. They never seemed even to sweat. And it felt as if they would go on forever. And so the story of these Cape carts in the Boer War became credible. The fact of the matter was that every Boer leader and most of the junior leaders in the Boer army travelled in one of these. The rest of them travelled on horseback on their ponies. And although General Cronje came in with a very beaten pair in his Cape cart to surrender after the Battle of Paardeberg, the story was very different later on. Because after a series of defeats in pitched battles, the Boers, as most people know, started what was really the first guerrilla war with which the British Army had yet been confronted. And they found it very, very difficult to catch up with them. There was one particular Boer general called Duet, who 4 times defeated the British cavalry and slipped out of their clutches after they were sure that they got him surrounded. But his cart took him away. I think in those days the established marching pace of the cavalry in the British Army was 45 miles an hour. They say that Duet was capable of travelling 100 miles a day, 45 miles a day, the cavalry, and Duet, they say, would travel 100 miles a day, and I believe it. And as for riding, it would tackle any amount of rough ground. Unlike the Tonga, the curricle had been so unsafe. We took this over the roughest ground we could find, and we trotted them on, and it was really like a good boat in the sea, the way it went. Well, absolutely lovely, the way it goes. And this is the story of why they had 2 horses in a 2-wheeled cart. It illustrates it, this particular picture, because all the tracks in Africa had been made by the bullock carts. And the great bullock teams, 12 in a team, went across the countryside, and naturally enough they just dug 2 ruts, and nothing ever trod in between. This looks a little like it. In Africa it was much worse. There were just 2 ruts in which the bullocks walked, and a rough hump in between, and there was no way that a single horse could pull a cart satisfactorily in that sort of country. But in the Cape cart, the two horses trotted in the bullock's grooves, and the rut went in between them. And that's how they were able to travel so well. I'd had fantasies about these Boer generals ever since my father had told me the story of them. Not only of De Wet, who 4 times escaped from the British cavalry after they thought he got him cornered, but the General Kruger, who was the leader of the whole Boer army and the president of the Boer state, who was over 70 years old. And finally, as the war drew to an end, they were absolutely sure that they'd got him. But once again, no. He outflanked and outdistanced the British army in his Cape cart. He slipped away in Lorenzo Marks, and he got a steamer back to Holland. So they never caught him. Really, it was one of the best summers of my life that we spent on this project. Carry an idea in your mind from the age of 10 to the age of over 70 and finally be able to do it and find out that it worked out absolutely perfectly. I really think they go on forever. And they did go on all day on this particular day. At a steady trot all day, and they never showed a bead of sweat. In a pinch, of course, the Boers would gallop these carts across country. And we've got an idea that when next summer comes, when we're really used to all this, we're going to have a go at that too. So finally I played the part of the Boer general. Not, of course, Cronje, the one that surrendered, but the one that got away. There you are, a farm boy's dream that took half a century to realize. And largely due to the man who experimented with me, Jeff Mitchell. You couldn't have a better man to do it. They tell me that although there's a Cape cart in England, there may not be any in Africa, but of course they're wrong, because I found this picture of an African gentleman driving 2 donkeys, Cape cart in, what is it, the backside of a Hillman minx? Cheerio.